Okay, so now we've reached the talk about the elephant in the room that everyone's been trying to avoid, namely the Palestinian issue. About a month ago, we marked 30 years since the Madrid conference that triggered the beginning, that triggered the political process that eventually led to Oslo and the Palestinian Authority. And there was the processes that brought us back to that turned things backwards and took us back to the starting point, creating a dilemma that Israel is facing regarding where Israel and the Palestinians currently stand and where we are going. And this is a little bit, it's a frustrating story that involves a lack of confidence among Israeli society, among the Palestinians, and among the international community about the possibility of launching a process like the one that was launched 30 years ago. And we also see lack of interest among many different parties when it comes to the Palestinian issue, and it being pushed aside in favor of other more pressing issues. So we decided to dive into this issue and look into the future of the issue of Israel and the Palestinian people. This is an issue that many Israelis prefer to avoid because it's frustrating and because there are other things to talk about, and it's very difficult to examine it in depth and until it blows up in our faces. So we'd like to hold a discussion with these three panelists. Each will present their perspective of this issue. Dr. Micah Goodman, who's been presented, he's an author, he's written several books. He is a researcher of Jewish thought over the years. Micah, you recently wrote Catch 67 and the Attention Revolution. Dr. Wolf, head of governance and law here at the Reichman University, who deals with international legal perspectives of the Palestinian people, and Ohad Hemo, journalist from Channel 12, winner of the Sokolov Award, who for many years has been presenting deep insights from the Palestinian region. So let's begin our discussion. The first question that I would like to ask you all is about the present. What is happening today? It's now 20 years since the beginning of the Al-Aqsa Intifada and 30 years since Oslo, and it's clear that the plans for Oslo are difficult or impossible to implement today because of the situation in the Palestinian society and because there's increased integration between the authorities. You studied this difficult situation in the occupied territories over the past years. I want to go beyond the book to the moment when you said, Michael, Israel lost interest in the conflict. The situation in Israel is that there's a lack of curiosity, a lack of interest in the conflict. So how did that happen? After the Six-Day War, the Israelis were not at all were very, very interested. The right was off topic. There was a utopia. They were thinking that if we settle the territories, then the redemption would come. And on the other hand, the opposite approach was that if we leave the territories, then the entire Middle East will recover, will be repaired. Israel will become part of the international community thanks to an agreement of this kind. There was a situation of utopia for many, many years on both sides, but these utopias collapsed, and these dreams were replaced with apocalypse. The right, in most cases, don't say that if we settle the territories, Messiah will come. They say something different. They say if we leave the territories, then there will be missiles against Tel Aviv. It'll be catastrophic. The left, and it's interesting to note that the left went through a similar process. They don't talk about peace. They talk about occupation. They don't say that if we leave the territories, there'll be a peace process. They say that if we stay there, then it'll be an ethical and a political and economical catastrophe. They went from utopia to doomsday, meaning the approach today that is that it will be catastrophic to implement the plans of the opposite side. So what happened on the right and on the left? It happens it happened on both sides over the last 20 years, moving from peace to occupation. That's where the center appeared. And when I talk to the center, I'm not talking about the people who vote for the center factions. I'm talking about the sentiment that's very popular among Israeli society, which says the following. First of all, when the right and left talked about utopia, the center says, I'm not on either extreme. Well, when both sides choose anxiety and strength, the center is in both, takes some of both. And that's what happens with anxiety. When people are anxious, people are scared of heights, they'll become scared of closed places as well. People don't accumulate dreams, they accumulate anxieties. The center parties, the center ideology believe that if we don't stay in the territories, then we're risking our lives. But if we do stay, then we're risking our lives. If we stay, then we're endangering the demographics, and if we don't, then we're endangering our security. So the result is that no matter what we do, we're in trouble. So they decide not to even talk about it and focus on other issues. Why don't the ultra-Orthodox serve in the army? With the prices of cheeses in the supermarkets, since there are no good ideas about the conflict, they stop talking about the conflict. There's a transition from dreams to anxiety to indifference, and that is tragic. And I think, and we might talk about this later on, I think that the healthier solution for Israeli society, when we're confused, I think that we've transitioned from confusion to indifference, and I would like to transition it into pragmatism. Now we're going to zoom in on the Palestinians. As many people have been following you for many years, and you've been sounding a voice that's not heard often enough in Israeli society, and that is the acceptance of the Palestinian people of the one-state solution. You're right, and thank you for this opportunity to raise such an important issue, an issue that is so important for Israel as a Jewish and democratic country. We keep talking about Iran as the existential threat, but the Palestinian threat issue is no less of a risk. I would like to talk about one specific incident. In August 2020, two places at the separation gate near Kalkilia and near the West Bank. During the weekend, those points were breached, on the fence were breached. 200,000 Palestinians entered Israel. We're talking about an enormous number of Palestinians. I received calls from excited people saying that we're here in Jaffa, people that were released in the Gilad Shalit agreement, saying that they're in Israel for the first time. That weekend, there were 200,000 Palestinians, and that was the erasing of the Green Line. It was very, very dramatic. I wrote a book that I called Returning to 87, called On the Surface. And why 87? First of all, returning, that we talked about, the returning of the 60s and the 70s, there's a new return that they're talking about. When I talk to the Palestinians, they don't talk about destroying the state of Israel. They're not there anymore. But the issue of returning, not at the expense of the state of Israel, but alongside the state of Israel, 87 is the beginning of the first intifada. At the time, the situation was utopian. There was one single geographic, almost political entity. It was incredible. The Green Line was irrelevant at the time. The distinction between our political opinions, right and left, was all related to the Green Line. And that was the MO at the time, the deciding factor that almost didn't exist at the time. If you talk to young Palestinians, and I do so often, 42%, according to surveys done a year ago, 42% of young Palestinians talk about a one-state solution. And I think the numbers are much higher. Whenever I visit refugee camps, cities, villages, almost everyone is talking about a single state. They talk about disappointment with the Palestinian Authority, hatred for the Palestinian Authority. It's corrupt, it's bad, it's problematic. Not to us. From our perspective, black and white, Hamas is bad, PA is good. When it comes to Israel, I'm being very brief, I'm sorry, but from the Palestinian perspective, the PA is bad for them. And suddenly there's Israel. Israel is like the Americans, for what the Americans were to us in the 1960s. We're speaking a universal language. Those Palestinian youth, their parents talked about Palestinian sovereignty. They talked about the Palestinian flag. But the young people are less interested in that. What they want is an income. They want jobs. They want financial security. They want physical security. They want to get to the beach. That's as a code. But they can't. They can't achieve that. And the discourse today, what you hear today, all over the territories, is disappointment with the two-state solution. They realize that Israel is not going to let that happen. The PA is not going to let that happen. They say they want one state. They say let's get rid of the separation fence. And I wanted to talk about an example of a conversation I had with a Hamas person who said that he feels like an Israeli citizen. He says, I'm a second-class citizen, but in 20, 30 years, the two of us will be equal. Remember that sentence. Everything you said is unbelievable, because when you look at the one-state solution, it's been around for 50 years among the Palestinian people. It was on the margins, but it's become mainstream, and that's something that the Israeli society should be aware of. Now let's cross the ocean, Dana, 2021, approaching 2022, looking at the international community, especially Washington and the Europeans. Are they interested? Are we and the Palestinians something that are on their agenda? I must say that they are interested, but less than before, because the world is changing and because of other global challenges that concern them more. But there's also the anomaly of reality. We're talking about the distinction between a one-state and a two-state solution when we actually have three sovereign entities. Israel, of course, is an independent country. The Palestinian Authority that was established by Oslo, and then there is Gaza. And Gaza has more characteristics of a state than the PA. It has an army, and it takes action against the state of Israel. The fact that the discourse is about a two-state solution is problematic, considering the fact that the situation has changed. So how can we continue having this discussion about an international agreement that talks about a two-state solution when in fact it is no longer realistic because there are three entities? So the international community is experiencing an anomaly with reality. And I think the state of Israel has an excellent opportunity now to take this reality and take it forward. Israel's arguments are very good. Let's put things on the table. In 2005, Israel took a step in the direction of a two-state solution. You can object to it or accept it, but the military disengagement, the military and civilian disengagement that it did was a significant step. The world should have applauded us. We had taken a step in the direction of a two-state solution, but what we got instead was missiles, non-stop terror, attacks against the civilian population, prisoners were taken, and claimed that we have ongoing responsibility, which does not exist in international law, for the Gaza Strip. We are not there neither from the civilian or military perspective. So now expecting Israel to progress with a two-state solution when Gaza is an entity in itself, that's unrealistic, because how could you Because what type of entity would pursue an idea that is so unrealistic? Israel should have recruited the international community years ago, but it's still not too late. There are many ways of doing so. The international community must be recruited in order to regulate the Gaza Strip in ways that have been talked about here at Reichman University. This has to be done in a decisive manner in order to achieve the two-state solution. We will talk about the future and address the issue of us and the international community. Now I would like to look ahead toward the future. We talked about reality. And we're also asking ourselves about the direction in which we're going. And the discussion will also be related to the manner in which you analyze the present. Looking ahead, what should Israel expect in the next few years? We're talking about a third intifada, Palestinian Spring, all these catastrophes that aren't happening, but maybe we should expect some type of peace and quiet. I will tell the audience in this hall and to those who are watching us, Michael, we talked about a week ago and you said something amazing. You said that everyone's waiting for the next explosion. Every time I talk to a Palestinian, people ask, when is the next intifada? But the next explosion isn't the real threat. The peace and quiet is the threat. Are we approaching a third intifada? I don't think so. And I must say that I haven't seen energies or signs of a third intifada. And the book that I wrote that in 1993 the Palestinians made a strategic decision to choose peace. In the year 2000 they made a strategic decision to choose war. And in 2005, the strategic decision was not to decide. And I think that's our story as well. Are we approaching a major conflict? I don't think so. There are different scenarios of the disengagement of the Palestinian Authority, the death of Abu Mazen, violence, but I don't think the society is there. I don't sense energy for violence. The second intifada is still very traumatic in the Palestinian narrative. There is a new young generation, and they still hear about the horrors of the second intifada. I think that the story is to keep pushing ahead and understand that there's a process that's almost deterministic. We know where it's going to, we know where we are, we know where it's going to end. And someone once said about once every 7 or 8 years, there's a cycle. Since 2000, every 7 to 8 years, there's an intifada. There's some type of intifada. So we may see violence. That is possible. But looking at the graph, if we look at the aircraft carrier that we call the Palestinian-Israel conflict, is going in that direction. And I'm sorry, I don't have anything better to say, but I think that's the reality.
Now we go back to the international arena. How do you see the Europeans, the Americans, the international community in our issue? The motivation is not low, unless a catastrophe happens. But I can tell you that the international community doesn't want to intervene in the Gaza Strip. The Americans have a bitter experience with Afghanistan, again, an organization of terror, not even a hybrid. The motivation is not high. It requires a lot of effort. But I think that the first time in Guardian of the Walls campaign, we saw recognition, at least in the situation where Gaza is separated from Judea and Samaria. That's the advantage of international law. When you look at facts objectively, the two entities are separate. They were also separate before 1967 because Gaza was under Egyptian regime. That's the reality. The international community should have a lot of motivation to deal with it, and it doesn't have it. So I think that in the campaign there was a recognition that maybe without the solution of Gaza we cannot go to two-state solution. So maybe there will be motivation. Israel also has to turn the disc of the 90s and to say to the world, we can turn Gaza maybe as a different, separate zone or demilitarized zone, or it's quite difficult to convince the world to invest in such a place. Yes, it is difficult, but from a legal point of view, sovereignty, it's just recognition. The world understands now that Gaza is not part of the Palestinian Authority. And this is a strategic insight which is not part of the discourse. As simple as it is, and as obvious as it is, and it doesn't change, no matter what we strive for and what we think and how we connect the two. Maybe the Palestinians will combine the two. They tried all sorts of unifications, but these are our wishes, what we want to happen. But we as legalists look at reality, and that is Israel has very harsh complaints about it. So this is an opportunity whereby big global moves of threats, the Iranian threats and internal threats of pandemic and collapse. Israel has an edge. It's a strong economy, technology. We can really advance many states around us, together with Americans, to demilitarize Gaza. Otherwise, we don't have a solution of the three sovereignties, and then we come to a situation that really we're going to have another intifada. Micha, the future and us, Israel. You developed the term of solution of the conflict. You hear it also in the Palestinian discourse. Do you think this is a kind of something that we can live with for a while? Maybe a decade. Look, I listened very carefully to the two speakers. Thank you. Both of you put Gaza on the table. Dana says, after we left Gaza and it's a terror state, the world cannot allow us to build a state there. It's going to be a terror state. It's going to threaten most of the Israelis. Ohad says, what happens if we leave Gaza as is? This is going towards one state. So if we do nothing, we're going to go to a catastrophe of one state, and this is the end of Israel as a Jewish democratic state. If we want to restore Gaza, then we are replacing one catastrophe with another. So what do we do? How do we prevent the catastrophe of Ohad without replacing it with Dana's catastrophe? This is failing cities not to create a Hamastan in Judea and Samaria. Maybe we should do some unilateral steps by Israel. We're not talking about the state, which is binary. Either yes or the autonomy. Autonomy, it's a category that enables you to think maybe there'll be more autonomy or less. How do we double the number of people in the Palestinian areas without jeopardizing the Israeli security? That neutralizes, postpones one state solution, but it doesn't prevent it altogether. I don't know if it's going to prevent. At the moment, we have a deterministic process of crawling annexation. Let's stop the catastrophe that Ohad was speaking about of one state, not by radical means that will bring about another catastrophe, Gaza and Judea and Samaria. I think that's how it's going to maybe reduce the conflict. It's not a solution, but this is a maneuver that will prevent catastrophes. Yes, it's a challenging idea, Micha. I think we should have this discussion for many hours with many people, but of course we are short in time. But one advantage that we have from this discussion and the interview before, at least we opened it up, this discourse. It's not trivial, and we should have the people of Israel deal with it. And apart from the hope to develop this discourse, I hope our next discussion will be much more optimistic. Here it's a bit despairing, but that's why we have to do things, not just to hope for them. So I thank you. I thank you, all of you.